Hello everyone. Last week we spoke about Ezra the scribe and the exiles on their return from Babylon. I just want to review briefly and then we'll move forward. Let's recall, the first temple was destroyed in 586 before the Common Era by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel. The exiles were gone for the 70 years as had been prophesied by Jeremiah, and then through the shifting sands of the political alliances of the east, Persia conquers the Babylonian Empire. In the vision of Daniel, this is the transition from the head of gold to the arms and chest of silver. And in the mind of Ezra, we said that this is the hands of God acting through Persia to return the Jews to their homeland. Now, for some larger context, it's important to remember that this return is not an independent action. From here on out, Am Yisrael and its ability to live history will no longer be the local context of the period of remez that we've spoken about, meaning in local context, but is beginning to move into the phase of drash, right? The extraction of meaning, the pursuit of truth in its total context. And as such, the world itself is becoming a total context. What do I mean? The sages will teach us that there's a difference between the sanctity of Eretz Israel when it was conquered by Joshua before the First Temple period, and the sanctity of Eretz Israel that it gained when it was re-sanctified by the returnees from Babel. It's called Kedusha Rishona and Kedusha Shnia. The difference is because the first Kedusha came through conquest, and the second one came through acquisition. What do I mean? Joshua conquered, and therefore when he in turn, or his descendants rather, were conquered and driven from the land, any sanctity that he gave to the land was considered to be null. Whereas Ezra acquires the land from Cyrus. And the acquisition of the land will actually, somewhat counterintuitively, give it a greater level of holiness. In a sense, the world is shifting from the model of might is right to some sort of shared context of value. That's what it means to be able to make an acquisition. We have to be able to communicate. We have to agree that the terms of the agreement are even relevant to both of us. This shared context of value is what will give Ezra the right in the eyes of the world to be back in Eretz Israel, and amazingly will give the sages the sense that the sanctification that will happen during the Second Temple period, which we'll speak about at length, will be the sanctification that the land of Israel will gain forever. Now, the whole world at this point in history is gradually being tied together through structures of commerce, borders, and the emergence of shared legal structures. Truth, the shared legal structures are still a bit on the horizon, but by the time that Rome appears, they'll become quite important. This process of integration, of becoming one world, is a process that we really merit in our day, seems to be reaching its fruition. And the idea that I could spread my thoughts to you, potentially around the world. So keep your eye out, because from the beginning to the end, we're going to call this the period of drush, seeking meaning in total context. Now, what's the role that Ezra the scribe will play as Am Yisrael leaves its meaning in local context and moves its search for meaning into total context? Well, he's going to build walls. What do I mean? Well, Kipshuto, he builds walls. It's not him. It's Nechemia, his political partner, who will come and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem to keep them safe from their enemies. In addition, one of the major battles that Ezra will fight will be the battle against assimilation, specifically intermarriage. If you open up the 9th chapter of Ezra and you read about him tearing his shirt and pouring ashes on his hair and laying on the ground in mourning when he hears that the leaders of Am Yisrael have fallen prey to the same sins that caused them to go into exile in the first place, the sin of intermarriage, you'll understand his pain. But most importantly, if you look closely, when he cries out to God, he says, Lord, you've given us a gader in Yehuda, a wall. You've built for us a wall. Nechemia will join him in this process, not only by building the physical walls of Jerusalem, but using them to shut the gates and wall in the Sabbath. Shabbat becomes a wall for the Jewish people. Now, the question is, what's the purpose of a wall? Well, generally it can serve two purposes, as we spoke about last week. It can keep what's precious in, or it can keep what's not wanted out. But in the scope of history, as we move into this new phase of time of drush, it's very important that this wall actually serves as a system boundary. What do I mean? All systems, to a certain degree, maintain their own boundary. That which is the system, and that which is not. Now, this boundary has to be clear enough that the system can be defined, and yet it has to be flexible enough, porous enough, that it won't stagnate. In our case, Am Yisrael is now moving into the phase where they will take the truth of the Torah and attempt to apply it willingly or unwillingly to every situation the world can supply. By the time that in our day, there's no country, no language, no people, no race, no religion that the Jewish people have not sampled and compared to the truth that they carry. But in order to be able to do this process of expansive learning, there must be a definitive sense of self, right? The boundary must be clear, open enough to receive, porous enough to give, to interchange, and yet it must be clear who is Am Yisrael and who is not. And we will see as we move into the first major cross-cultural challenge that Am Yisrael faces when the Greeks appear on the scene. We will see that it is not a simple task to define who is Am Yisrael and who is not. So Ezra defines the status of the returnees from Babel as a wall, as we said in the 9th line of the 9th chapter, if you want to look it up. And it's important to note in the context of the story that we mentioned that when the nations who live in the surrounding areas come to Am Yisrael as they're rebuilding the second temple and say, let us join you. And Am Yisrael says no and rejects their help, even though this appears it could have been an affirmation of Isaiah's prophecy, Beiti, Beit Tfilah Yikarei L'Kol Amin, my house will be a house of prayer for all people. Nevertheless, their rejection and insistence on going alone establishes their presence as Am Yisrael and no one else. It is also, by the by, an affirmation that despite the political aspects of Cyrus's declaration and how one could come to view the world indeed as reflective of the false image of Malchut that was given to Nebuchadnezzar and translated by Daniel, nevertheless, the decision to build, even in the face of threat, is essentially a faith-based rejection of a strategic analysis of the historical reality. We will build, despite how absurd that may be. Interestingly enough, it also brings into the world an entirely new attitude toward the Jews. That now, instead of the difficulty or hatred of the Jews that was held by the nations with whom we were competing for the land, there will be a new type of hatred of the Jews. And that's the hatred of the Jews because they insist on being the Jews and not allowing anyone else to be. We'll follow that through many phases of history. Lastly, I want to mention a major shift that's happening in Am Yisrael that we'll really explore next week as we talk about the men of the Great Assembly. And this is the shift in the model of leadership from prophecy to wisdom. Prophecy is essentially experiential, right? The voice of God flowing through the nation and finding its outlet through the prophet. The model of education of the wise will not be experiential, but rather educational, right? We must teach you how to know. As we said, Daniel places the primary task of Am Yisrael not as leading history, but as rather seeing the hand of God in history and calling his name. So too, the wise will set the primary task not as hearing the voice of God, but learning to know his will in every task that life supplies. And as we move forward into the men of the Great Assembly, we will talk about this transition from the prophets to the wise.